73-year-old man proves it's never too late. Power of thinking big story. They called him a fool, a madman living in delusions. But what if I told you that the poorest man in an ancient village, with nothing but worn robes and empty pockets, discovered a secret so powerful it would change everything? This is not just a story. This is a truth that the world tried to bury. Stay until the end, because what happens in the final moment will shake everything you thought you knew about destiny. In the days when empires rose and fell like desert sandstorms, there lived a man named Ezra. 73 years of age, bent by time, weathered by disappointment. The village of Kadesh knew him well. Too well. He was the dreamer who never stopped dreaming. The fool who spoke of impossible things while his stomach growled with hunger. His wife had left him 20 years prior, unable to watch him chase shadows. His son refused to speak his name, ashamed to call such a man father. But here's what no one understood. Ezra carried a fire inside that age could not extinguish. Every morning, before the sun painted the sky copper and gold, Ezra would climb the hill outside Kadesh. His knees ached. His bones protested. But he climbed. And there, overlooking the village that mocked him, he would close his eyes and see something they couldn't see. A vision of abundance. A future where his family ate from full tables. Where his name meant something besides failure. Then came the morning that changed everything. But I'll get to that. First, you need to understand what Ezra had lost. 20 years ago, he'd owned a small plot of land. Not much, but enough. He'd planted olive trees, dreaming they would one day provide for generations. But a drought came. The trees withered. Creditors came like vultures, and they took it all. His land. His dignity. His wife looked at him that final night and said words that would haunt him forever. "Your dreams are killing us, Ezra. Choose. Your family or your fantasies." He'd chosen wrong. Or had he? The village elders would gather in the marketplace shaking their heads. At his age, they'd whisper, still talking about changing the world. If you waste your youth, old age brings only regrets. Merchants would laugh when he passed. Children would mimic his limp, his weathered voice speaking of impossible things. But those villagers didn't know something very important. On the night his wife left, Ezra didn't break. He should have. Any reasonable man would have. Instead, something inside him crystallized into something harder than stone. He made a promise to the stars that night. "I will prove that it's never too late. I will prove that a dream postponed is not a dream destroyed." Foolish? Perhaps. But fools sometimes see what wise men miss. For 20 years he lived on scraps. He mended clothes for copper coins. He carried water for merchants who insulted him. He slept in a corner of the synagogue when winter came. And every single day he climbed that hill. Not to pray, to plan. Here's where it gets strange. And I need you to pay attention, because this detail matters. Ezra began to notice something. In his morning meditations on the hill, he would enter a state, not quite sleep, not quite waking, where his mind became crystal clear. He could see patterns others missed. He understood things he had no business understanding. A young merchant's daughter called it divine madness. The rabbi called it heresy. But Ezra, he called it listening to the voice the world had taught everyone to ignore. The voice that whispers, "You are capable of more." That morning, the one I mentioned, began like any other. Ezra climbed his hill. The sun rose, indifferent to his suffering. He sat on his rock, closed his eyes, and waited for that clarity to come. But this time, something was different. A cold rain began to fall, unusual for that season. The kind of rain that seeps into your bones and makes you question every choice you've made. Ezra was about to descend to seek shelter when it happened. Not a voice. Not a vision. Something more subtle and more powerful. A knowing. An absolute certainty that crashed through him like lightning through a tree. He saw it. Not with his eyes, but with something deeper. The answer to everything. Tears mixed with rain on his weathered face. Not tears of sadness. These were different. These were the tears of a man who had been wandering in darkness for 73 years and suddenly glimpsed light. But what had he seen? Hold that thought, because while Ezra sat on that hill, something else was happening in Kadesh. A wealthy merchant from the city, a man named Tobias, had arrived with his caravan. Tobias was known throughout the region for one thing: his ability to recognize value where others saw worthlessness. He had built his fortune not by working harder, but by seeing differently. And Tobias had a problem, a very specific problem that required a very specific solution, a problem that everyone said was impossible to solve. Now, I need to tell you about Miriam, Ezra's granddaughter. 11 years old, with her grandfather's eyes, but her father's bitterness. She had been forbidden from seeing the old fool, the family disgrace. But children are curious, and Miriam was more curious than most. She'd been secretly watching Ezra for months, following him up that hill, hiding behind rocks, listening to him speak to the wind about impossible things. And something in his words, in his unshakable belief, had planted a seed in her young heart. That morning when the rain fell, Miriam followed him again. She saw him freeze, saw his tears. And when he descended the hill, walking with a purpose she'd never seen before, she followed him into the village. Ezra walked straight to the marketplace, to where Tobias stood, frustrated, arguing with the village elders. The problem? The merchant needed to transport precious cargo across the desert to the capital, but bandits had made the traditional routes deadly. 3 caravans had been lost. No one could figure out how to get through. The elders suggested more guards. Tobias shook his head. Guards invite fights. I need a way that avoids conflict entirely. That's when Ezra stepped forward. The crowd hushed. Then someone laughed. Then everyone laughed. The crazy old man with empty pockets had something to say? This would be entertaining. I know the way, Ezra said. His voice didn't waver. Tobias studied him. Unlike the villagers, the merchant didn't laugh. He saw something in the old man's eyes, that clarity, that certainty. Everyone says there is no safe route, Tobias replied carefully. Everyone is looking at the same map, Ezra said. I'm looking at a different one. The crowd jeered. But Tobias raised his hand for silence. Explain. Here's what Ezra had seen in his vision. Not a new route through the desert, but a forgotten one. An ancient path that traders had abandoned generations ago because it required passing through territories of tribes considered hostile. But Ezra understood something no one else did. Those tribes weren't hostile to trade. They were hostile to disrespect. I spent my youth traveling, Ezra said. Before I settled here, before I lost everything, I lived among those tribes. They taught me their language, their customs. They're not enemies. They're allies no one has bothered to speak with in 50 years. Tobias leaned forward. And you could speak to them, negotiate passage? More than that, Ezra said. I could give you something more valuable than safe passage. I could give you exclusive trading rights, make you the only merchant who can use that route. The marketplace went silent. Even the mockers held their breath. Tobias made Ezra an offer. If you succeed, I'll give you 1/3 of my profits, enough to restore your land, enough to restore your name. But if you fail, if this is just an old fool's fantasy, you'll be remembered as the man who cost me my fortune and my life. Ezra didn't hesitate. I accept. His son, watching from the crowd, felt something crack inside his chest. Shame or something else? Young Miriam, still hiding, gripped her hands together and prayed to every god she knew. The journey that followed lasted 40 days. I won't recount every step, but I'll tell you this. Ezra led that caravan through territories that made seasoned warriors nervous, through lands where death waited behind every dune, and at each tribal settlement, he didn't arrive as a merchant seeking passage. He arrived as an old friend returning home. The tribes remembered him, remembered the young man who'd lived among them, who'd learned their songs, who'd honored their ways. They didn't just grant passage, they celebrated. They offered guides. They shared intelligence about safe paths and dangerous areas. What the villages had seen as hostile territories, Ezra saw as home. Tobias watched in amazement. This wasn't just about knowing a route. This was about something deeper. This was about a man who had spent his entire life, every hardship, every failure, every mocked dream, preparing for this exact moment. They reached the capital not just safely but ahead of schedule. Tobias's goods sold for triple their expected price. The exclusive trade route made him the wealthiest merchant in the region overnight. But here's what you need to understand. That's not the end of the story. That's not even the important part. When Ezra returned to Kadesh, he didn't arrive with wealth. Yes, Tobias had kept his promise. The profits were substantial. But Ezra gave it away. Not all at once. Strategically. He paid off debts for families who'd mocked him. He funded the village well that had run dry. He established a fund to help young people start businesses. His son came to him confused. "Father, you could have bought back your land. You could have proven them all wrong." Ezra smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in 20 years. "I already proved what needed proving, my son. Not to them. To myself." "What did you prove?" his son asked. "That thinking big isn't about grand destinations. It's about seeing value where others see emptiness. It's about knowing that every experience, even failure, is preparation. Those 20 years of poverty, they weren't wasted. They were schooling me in humility, teaching me to listen, preparing me to see what others missed." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I will be rich, but helping those in need. What is the use of being rich, but indifferent to the suffering of others? I was trying to prove that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. That dreams don't die with youth. They crystallize with age into something harder and truer." Miriam, now brave enough to approach openly, asked, "Grandfather, what was that vision you saw on the hill, in the rain?" Ezra knelt, meeting her eyes. "I saw that every person walking past me calling me fool was carrying the same empty pockets I was. But theirs were pockets of the spirit. Mine had been empty of fear for 20 years. And once you empty yourself of fear, the universe rushes in to fill you with purpose." He lived comfortably to be 102. He bought a small farm, built a beautiful house, and lived off what the land provided. Criticized by some, admired by others, but with the respect of all for having helped the community. His son rebuilt their relationship. His grandchildren would sit at his feet, listening to stories of the impossible made possible. And on his final day, as the sun set copper and gold, his last words were these: "Tell them, tell everyone, it is never ever too late. The only grave that should terrify you is the one where you bury your dreams while you're still breathing." Call to action. If this story moved you, press the like button and don't forget to subscribe, because every week I bring you stories that don't just inspire, but ignite. Stories that prove the power of thinking big, no matter how empty your pockets, no matter how late the hour. Thanks for watching. This is just the beginning.